My brother secretly changed Grandma's funeral date, then blamed me for missing it. I stood in the arched doorway of the Canaan Baptist Fellowship Hall, my charcoal silk suit perfectly pressed, a single strand of heirloom pearls resting against my collarbone. In my arms, I carried 24 long-stemmed white lilies, their scent thick and cloying in the humid Georgia afternoon. I had driven 4 hours from Charlotte, pushed through 3 conference calls, and skipped lunch to ensure I was here a full day early to oversee the final arrangements for Hattie Mae Hollowell, the woman who raised me, the woman I had transitioned into hospice, the woman whose medical bills I had quietly settled for the last 6 years. But as I looked into the room, I didn't see a committee of mourning deacons or the quiet preparation of a wake. I saw half-eaten plates of fried chicken and potato salad. I saw crumpled napkins and the dregs of sweet tea in plastic cups. I saw my cousins laughing in the corner, and my Aunt Reba dabbing at her eyes while tucking a Tupperware container into her oversized purse. The funeral wasn't tomorrow. The funeral was over. Beverly? The voice was like a slow-moving tide, thick with a performative grief that made my skin crawl. I turned my head slowly. My brother, Terrence Vance Hollowell, was walking toward me. He had managed to find a black suit that actually fit his frame, likely bought with the emergency travel funds I'd wired him 2 weeks ago. He held a crumpled linen handkerchief in his left hand, and his eyes were rimmed with a redness that I knew came more from expensive bourbon than from tears. "You're late, Bev," he said, his voice loud enough to cause the entire room to go silent. The laughter in the corner died. The scraping of forks stopped. "We waited. We really did. Pastor Miller even held the processional for 20 minutes, hoping you'd pull into the lot." I didn't blink. I felt the weight of the lilies in my arms. Heavy, useless things now. "The funeral is Saturday, Terrence. Tomorrow, at 11 o'clock. Terrence shook his head, a look of profound, patronizing disappointment crossing his face. He reached into his inner breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of cardstock. He snapped it open and held it up. It was the official program. "The homegoing celebration of Mrs. Hattie Mae Hollowell, Friday, July 10th, 10 a.m. "I sent you the final proof, Bev," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound intimate but loud enough for Aunt Reba to lean in. "I called you 4 times. I left voicemails. I told you the funeral home had a conflict with a larger service on Saturday, and we had to move it up. I guess you were just too busy with those big city contracts to check your messages." My phone was in my hand. I had no missed calls from him. I had no voicemails. My email inbox was a fortress of organization, and the last correspondence I had from the Hollowell Funeral Home, the business I was currently subsidizing, was a confirmation for Saturday morning. "You changed the date," I said. My voice was a low, steady vibration. "And you didn't tell me." "Beverly Jeanette," Aunt Reba said, walking over and placing a heavy, greasy hand on my shoulder. "Don't start this now. Not today. Your grandmother is barely cold in the ground, and you're here making a scene because you couldn't manage your schedule? We all make sacrifices to be here. Terrence has been here for 3 days straight, doing the heavy lifting while you were up there in your high-rise." "I paid for the casket, Aunt Reba," I said softly, looking her directly in the eye. "I paid for the plot. I paid for the vault. I paid for the very chicken you're currently packing into your bag." The room gasped. In our family, mentioning money was the ultimate sin. Worse than the neglect, worse than the lying. It was tasteless. It was cold. "See?" Terrence said, throwing his hands up. Everything is a transaction with you. You think because you write the checks, the world stops turning? Grandma didn't need your money today, Bev. She needed your presence. But I guess some things are more important than family. He looked around the room, gathering the silent votes of the witnesses. He saw the nods, the narrowed eyes directed at me, the cold, successful sister who thought she was better than her roots. Before I tell you what I did next, or how I realized exactly why my brother needed me to miss that service, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. It always moves me to see how many people across the world recognize these family dynamics. Have you ever been the one who did all the work, only to be cast as the villain the moment you weren't there to be used? I looked down at the program in Terrence's hand. The paper was high quality, cream-colored cardstock with gold foil. It was beautiful. It was also expensive. I noticed the logo at the bottom, a small, discreet crest of a printing house in Savannah, not the local shop I had authorized. I looked back at my brother. Underneath his mask of mournful, brotherly concern, there was a flicker of something else, a twitch at the corner of his mouth. It was the look he'd had when we were children and he'd broken Mama's favorite vase, then tucked the shards under my bed. It was the look of a man who had finally won a game I didn't even know we were playing. "The burial?" I asked. "Done," Terrence said, his tone clipped. "She's at rest, Bev, without you. We're just finishing up here. You might as well take those flowers to the cemetery, though it seems a bit late for gestures, don't you think?" I didn't answer. I didn't scream. I didn't demand to see his phone logs. I simply turned around. The silence of the fellowship hall followed me out into the blinding Georgia sun. I walked to my car, placed the white lilies on the scorched pavement of the parking lot, and got into the driver's seat. I didn't cry. My eyes were as dry as the red clay of the cemetery down the road. I sat there for a long time, the air conditioning humming, watching the funeral attendees trickle out of the hall. I watched Terrence walk out, laughing softly with a man I didn't recognize, a man in a sharp, cheap suit holding a briefcase. They didn't see me behind the tinted glass of my SUV. I watched Terrence accept a sympathy envelope from a church deacon, tucking it into his pocket with a practiced, somber nod. My brother thought he had humiliated me. He thought he had successfully painted me as the heartless, career-obsessed granddaughter to ensure I wouldn't have a seat at the table when the will was read. He thought that by changing the date, he had changed my standing in this family. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't just the one who paid the bills. I was the one who held the keys. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed a number I had saved under personal counsel. "It's Beverly," I said when the voice answered. "We need to move the timeline up. He's already started." "Are you sure, Bev?" the voice asked. "Once we execute the audit on the estate and the funeral home's books, there's no going back. He's your brother." I watched Terrence light a cigarette, leaning against his car, looking entirely too satisfied with himself. "I don't have a brother," I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. "I have a debtor, and I've decided to stop carrying the interest." I put the car in gear and drove past the cemetery without stopping. Grandma wasn't in that hole in the ground. She was in the lessons she'd taught me about dignity, about silence, and about knowing when to stop pouring water into a cracked pot. Terrence wanted a performance. He wanted a scene. He wanted me to beg for forgiveness for a sin he had manufactured. Instead, I was going to give him exactly what he'd always pretended I was: a cold, calculated businesswoman who knew exactly how to close an unprofitable account. The iron gates of the Hollowell estate, a title far more grand than the modest three-bedroom ranch-style house deserved, groaned as I pushed them open. This house, sitting on 3 acres of prime Georgia soil just outside Savannah, was the only thing our family truly owned. My grandfather, a man who worked 3 jobs and never owned more than 2 pairs of shoes at once, had bought this land when the world told men like him they weren't allowed to stand on it. I parked my SUV behind Terrence's car. His trunk was still popped, revealing a messy heap of floral arrangements and black ribbon. As I stepped onto the porch, I could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and the clinking of ice in glasses. I didn't knock. I hadn't knocked on this door in 42 years. The moment I stepped into the foyer, the air changed. It was as if I were a sudden draft of cold air entering a warm room. My cousin Sheila was standing by the mahogany sideboard, a plate of deviled eggs in her hand. She froze, her eyes darting to the hallway where the rest of the family was gathered. "Oh," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Beverly, you're still here?" "I'm still here, Sheila," I said, my voice smooth and low. I began peeling off my kid leather gloves, one finger at a time. "I haven't quite finished my business in town." "Terrence said you were heading back to Charlotte. He said you were too distraught to stay for the repass." "Is that what he said?" I walked past her, my heels making a rhythmic, authoritative click on the hardwood. In the living room, the inner circle was holding court. Aunt Reba was in Grandma's velvet armchair, the chair no one was allowed to sit in while Hattie Mae was alive. My younger sister, Cassandra, was sitting on the floor at Reba's feet, and Terrence was leaning against the mantel, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "There she is," Terrence said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "I told them you'd come by to say your goodbyes to the house, Bev. I was just telling Aunt Reba how hard it must be for you, being so disconnected from the family rhythm that you got the dates mixed up." Cassandra looked up at me. She was 38, but in this house, she was forever the baby. I had paid her tuition at Spelman. I had paid her down payment on her condo in Atlanta. I had even paid for her divorce attorney 2 years ago. "Bev, honestly," Cassandra said, sighing as if I were the one being difficult. "You could have at least checked the family group chat. Terrence posted the update 3 days ago." I pulled my phone out. "I'm looking at the chat right now, Cassandra. The last message in here is from me, asking what time the florist was delivering the spray for the casket." No one responded. "That's because we were busy, Beverly," Aunt Reba snapped, her voice sharp. "Some of us were actually here, holding Hattie's hand while she breathed her last. Some of us were picking out the dress. Some of us were making sure the choir had their robes. You think because you sent a wire transfer, you're exempt from the labor of grief? You missed the funeral. Own it. Stop trying to blame your brother for your own priorities." The injustice of it was a physical weight. I had spent the last 6 months flying down every weekend. I was the one who spoke to the doctors. I was the one who changed the soiled linens when the nurses were slow to arrive. Terrence had only shown up when the hospice nurse mentioned that the end was near. But in the eyes of the family, the one who shows up for the show is the hero. The one who maintains the foundation is just the help. "I see," I said. I didn't argue. I didn't present my evidence. I simply looked at Terrence. He didn't look back. He was very interested in the ice cubes in his glass. "Where is the briefcase, Terrence?" The room went still. "What briefcase?" Terrence asked, finally meeting my gaze. "The one the man in the sharp suit was holding in the parking lot of the church. The man who isn't a member of this family or this congregation." Terrence's grip on his glass tightened. That was an old friend from college, Marcus. He just came to show his respects. Marcus is a real estate developer, Terrence. I recognized him from the zoning board meetings in Savannah. I do business with his firm. Aunt Reba stood up, her face flushing a deep plum. Beverly Jeanette, if you are going to stand in this house of mourning and talk about business— I'm talking about Grandma's house, Aunt Reba, I interrupted, my voice dropping into that quiet, dangerous register that usually made my board of directors fall silent. Because I have a very strong feeling that the reason the funeral was moved to today, the reason I was intentionally excluded, is because someone needed to sign something, and they needed me 4 hours away when they did it. You're paranoid, Terrence spat. You've spent too much time in those boardrooms, Bev. You think everyone is out to get you. You think you're the only one Hattie Mae trusted. I don't think, I said. I know. I turned and walked toward the back of the house, toward Grandma's bedroom. Where are you going? Terrence called out, his voice rising, losing its polished edge. Beverly, that room is private. I didn't stop. I reached the door and turned the glass knob. The room smelled of lavender and old paper. The bed was made, the hospital equipment already whisked away, likely by the same Marcus who was so eager to clear the path. I went straight to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. It was locked. I reached into my blouse and pulled out the small silver key I'd worn on a chain for the last year. Hattie Mae had given it to me the night she realized she couldn't remember her own daughter's name, but she remembered mine. Beverly, she'd whispered, keep the foundation. Don't let them tear the stones down. I knelt and turned the key. The lock clicked, a heavy mechanical sound that felt like a gavel striking a bench. Behind me, I heard the heavy footsteps of Terrence entering the room. He wasn't pretending to be sad anymore. He looked frantic. You have no right to go through her things, Bev. I'm the oldest male. I'm the executor. You're the namesake, Terrence. You were never the executor, I said, lifting the lid. I bypassed the hand-stitched quilts and the old Bibles. I reached for the false bottom Grandma had shown me when I was 12 years old. I pressed the knot in the wood, and the panel popped up. Empty. The space where the original deed to the 3 acres should have been, along with the 1954 land survey and the handwritten will Grandma had drafted with a proper attorney 3 years ago, was empty. I stood up slowly, turning to face my brother. He was standing in the doorway, Aunt Reba and Cassandra hovering behind him like a Greek chorus of judgment. Where is it, Terrence? I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his eyes were darting to the corner of the room. The house belongs to the family. We're going to put it in a trust. That's what we discussed while you were away. We? I looked at Cassandra. You agreed to this? Cassandra looked at the floor. Terrence said it was the only way to save it, Bev. He said you were planning to sell it and put the money in your own accounts to recoup your losses for her medical bills. He said you told him we were a burden. The lie was so perfect, so tailored to their insecurities, that I almost wanted to applaud him. He had used my own generosity as the weapon to turn them against me. He had convinced them that my strength was a threat. I see, I said. I didn't defend myself. I didn't tell Cassandra that I had already set up a college fund for her kids that was double the value of this house. I didn't tell Aunt Reba that I was the one paying her mortgage every month through an anonymous church grant. If they wanted to believe I was the villain, I would stop auditioning for the role of the saint. Terrence, I said, stepping toward him. He actually flinched. You changed the date of the funeral so you could bring a notary here while I was driving down I-95. You had Grandma's thumbprint or a forged signature put on a deed transfer. You're selling this land to Marcus and his developers. It's a lot of money, Bev, Terrence finally broke, his voice a jagged edge of resentment. Money that could change all our lives, not just yours. You already have everything. Why do you care about this old, rotting house? Because it wasn't yours to sell, I said. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his. I didn't look back at the room full of people who had been eating from my hand while sharpening their knives. Beverly, Aunt Reba shouted. Where are you going? We're having the family dinner. Eat well, Auntie, I called back over my shoulder. Enjoy the chicken, because as of 5 o'clock this afternoon, the credit card on file for this repass and the catering has been deactivated. I heard a sharp intake of breath. And Terrence? I stopped at the front door, looking at the beautiful, heavy oak frame. I hope Marcus gave you a very large down payment. You're going to need it for the retainers. I walked out of the house. I sat in my car and took a deep breath. My heart was thumping, but not with fear. It was the rhythm of a cage door finally swinging open. I picked up my phone and dialed my assistant. Tracy, cancel my meetings for Monday and call the sheriff's department in Chatham County. I need to report a theft of legal documents. And Tracy, call the property tax office. Ask them who the owner of record is for the Hollowell property as of 4 hours ago. I waited, listening to the silence of the night. It says Vance Holdings, LLC, Beverly, Tracy said, her voice confused. That was registered just this morning. Vance, I whispered. My brother's middle name. He hadn't even been clever enough to hide behind a different ghost. Is there anything else? Yes, I said, watching the lights of the house flicker through the trees. Contact the utility companies for that address. Power, water, gas. They're all in my name. I want them disconnected. Tonight. Tonight? Bev, it's Friday night. There are people in that house. I know, I said. And they've spent a long time living in my light while telling me I'm the darkness. Let's see how they like the truth when the lights go out. I hung up. I sat in the dark, watching. 10 minutes later, the porch light flickered and died. Then the warm glow of the living room vanished. One by one, the windows of the Hollowell house turned into black squares against the purple sky. I heard the front door fly open. I heard Terrence's voice screaming into the night, calling my name. I heard Cassandra crying. I didn't move. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I just sat in the quiet of my own car, a woman who had finally put down a burden she was never meant to carry alone. The game was no longer about a funeral. It was about the foundation. And I was the only one who knew where the real gold was buried. The darkness that swallowed the house was absolute. Out here, miles from the city lights of Savannah, the night doesn't just fall. It settles like a heavy velvet shroud. I watched in the rearview mirror as the silhouette of my brother stumbled off the porch, his cell phone flashlight cutting a frantic, shaky path through the humidity. He reached my window and pounded on the glass. I didn't flinch. I didn't even turn my head. I simply pressed the button to crack the window exactly 1 inch, just enough to let his desperation in, but not enough to let him shatter my peace. Beverly! "What the hell are you doing?" he roared. His face was distorted in the glow of his phone, sweat beads glistening on his forehead. "The kids are in there! Aunt Reba is nearly 70 years old! You can't just cut the power!" "I didn't cut the power, Terrence," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "I discontinued a service I was no longer authorized to provide. Since the house now belongs to Vance Holdings, LLC, it's the responsibility of the new owner to ensure the utilities are in their name. I assume you have the deposit ready?" He choked on his next word. He knew, and I knew, that his bank account was a graveyard of overdraft fees and unpaid child support. He had counted on a grace period. He had counted on me being so blinded by the tradition of being the family provider that I would keep paying for the roof over the heads of the people who had just spat on mine. "You're being spiteful," he hissed, leaning closer to the gap in the window. "This is why nobody likes you, Bev. This is why you're alone in that big house in Charlotte. You have no soul. You'd rather see your own blood sit in the dark than lose an argument." "I'm not losing an argument, Terrence. I'm winning my freedom." I finally turned to look at him. "And as for being alone? I'd rather be alone in a house of my own making than be surrounded by people who only value me for what I can do for them, never for who I am." I rolled the window up. The seal clicked shut, muffling his curses. I put the car in reverse and backed down the long gravel driveway. In the headlights, I saw the white lilies I had left on the pavement. They looked like fallen stars against the black asphalt. I didn't go to a hotel. I didn't go back to Charlotte. I drove to a small whitewashed cottage 3 miles down the road, the home of Mrs. Eloise Vance. She wasn't my biological grandmother, but she was Hattie Mae's best friend for 60 years. They had been the twin pillars of Canaan Baptist. If Hattie Mae was the heart of the community, Eloise was its memory. When I pulled into her drive, the porch light was already on. She was sitting in a wicker rocker, a thin cardigan draped over her shoulders despite the heat. She didn't look surprised to see me. "You took your time, Beverly Jeanette," she said as I stepped out of the car. "The funeral was today, Miss Eloise," I said, walking up the steps. "Terrence moved it." "I know he did," she said, her voice like crumpled parchment. "He didn't invite me either. Sent a boy by with a note saying Hattie wanted a private, immediate family service. He knew I'd see right through him. He knew I'd tell you what he was whispering to that lawyer in the hospital hallway while Hattie was drifting in and out." I sat on the top step, looking out at the road. "He sold the land, Miss Eloise. Or he's in the process of it. He's got some LLC called Vance Holdings." The old woman let out a dry, sharp laugh. "Vance? He used my name? That boy always did have more audacity than sense. He thinks that land is just dirt and timber. He thinks Marcus Thorne is going to build a luxury subdivision and make them all millionaires." I froze. "How do you know Marcus Thorne?" "Marcus Thorne's daddy was the one who tried to cheat your grandfather out of that same land in 1968, Eloise said, leaning forward. "The Thornes have been eyeing that acreage for 3 generations. It's the highest point in the county. It doesn't flood, and the soil is sitting on a limestone shelf that's worth more than the houses they want to put on top of it." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. She handed it to me. "Hattie gave me this 2 months ago. She said, 'Eloise, my grandson has a hollow spirit. He's going to try to sell the bones of this family to feed his ego. When Beverly comes looking for the truth, give her the map. I unwrapped the silk. Inside was a heavy, tarnished brass key, much larger and older than the one I'd used on the cedar chest. Attached to it was a small metal tag with a series of coordinates stamped into it. "That's not for the house," Eloise whispered. "That's for the safe deposit box at the old Savannah Bank, the one your grandfather opened in 1955, the one that hasn't been touched since the day he died." "I thought that account was closed decades ago," I said, my heart beginning to race. "The bank thought so too. But your grandfather was a deacon, Beverly. He knew how to hide things in plain sight. He kept that box paid up for 100 years in advance, using a small trust he'd set up from his veterans' benefits. He told Hattie, 'Only the granddaughter with the steady hand gets the key.'" I looked at the coordinates. They weren't just for a bank box. They were GPS markers. "What's on the land, Miss Eloise? Really?" The old woman looked toward the dark horizon where my family's house stood. "Your grandfather didn't just buy that land to farm it, honey. He bought it because he was a surveyor's assistant during the war. He knew what the state was planning to do with the highway expansions 50 years before they did it. And he knew what was buried under the old smokehouse." I thought about Terrence, sitting in the dark right now, thinking he had won because he'd stolen a deed that I had already flagged as contested with the county clerk. I thought about Aunt Reba and Cassandra, who had traded their loyalty for the promise of a developer's check that would never clear. "They think I'm the cold one," I whispered. "Let them think it," Eloise said, patting my hand. "A woman's grace isn't about being sweet, Beverly. It's about being sure. You've spent your whole life being the umbrella for people who don't even thank you for staying dry. It's time you let it rain on them for a while." I stayed with Miss Eloise that night, sleeping in a guest room that smelled of starch and peppermint. For the first time in years, I didn't check my work email. I didn't look at my stock portfolio. I just watched the shadows of the trees dance on the ceiling and thought about the strong black woman trap. We are taught that our value is in our endurance. We are praised for how much we can carry, how many insults we can swallow, how many family members we can bail out of jail or debt. We are the backbone. But no one ever asks if the spine is scoliosed from the weight. Terrence had banked on my guilt. He had banked on the idea that I would never embarrass the family by taking legal action. He thought the cultural pressure to keep our business in the house would act as a shield for his theft. He was wrong. I wasn't going to embarrass the family. I was going to dismantle the lie they had built. The next morning, Saturday, the day the funeral should have been, the sun rose hot and unforgiving. My phone was blowing up with texts. "Cassandra, the police are here, Bev. They say we're trespassing. Tell them you didn't report the deed." Aunt Reba, "You are a disgrace to Hattie Mae's name. Turning out your own kin on the day of her rest? God is going to find you, Beverly." Terrence, "I'm going to sue you for everything you have. Marcus says the deed is ironclad. You're done." I deleted them all without replying. I dressed in a sharp cream-colored linen suit. I put on my pearls. I did my hair in a tight, elegant chignon. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was no longer a safety net. I was a storm. I drove to the old Savannah Bank. As I walked through the heavy glass doors, the cool air hit me. I walked straight to the manager's office. I didn't need an appointment. The manager, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had been there long enough to remember my grandfather, stood up when I entered. Miss Hollowell, he said, his voice respectful. I heard about your grandmother. My deepest condolences. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I'm here to access box 412. His face went pale. Box 412? Miss Hollowell, that's a legacy account. It hasn't been accessed in 40 years. We were under the impression... I have the key, I said, placing it on his mahogany desk. And I have the secondary authorization. I pulled out a small sealed envelope Hattie Mae had given me on her deathbed, the one everyone thought was just a final letter of love. Inside was a power of attorney that specifically superseded any general estate claims, dated and notarized 2 years ago. 10 minutes later, I was in the vault. The silence of the vault was different from the silence of the night. This was the silence of secrets. Henderson led me to a small, tarnished steel door at the very bottom of the furthest wall. He inserted his key, I inserted mine. The door groaned open. Inside was a single, heavy, leather-bound ledger and a small, velvet-lined box. I opened the box first. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't gold. It was a stack of mineral rights deeds. My grandfather hadn't just bought the land. He had separated the surface rights from the mineral rights, a legal maneuver that was almost unheard of for a black man in Georgia in the 1950s. He had sold the surface rights to himself and eventually Hattie Mae. But the mineral rights, the rights to everything under the dirt, were held in a separate trust. A trust that had only one named beneficiary, Beverly Jeanette Hollowell. I opened the ledger. In it, my grandfather had kept meticulous records of the limestone shelf Eloise had mentioned. But there was something else. A series of maps showing that the state highway expansion wasn't just a rumor. It was a project he had helped survey. He knew the state would have to buy the mineral rights to the limestone to secure the highway's foundation. The value listed at the bottom of the last page, calculated in 1982, was staggering. In today's market, with the new infrastructure bills, it was a fortune. But the most important thing wasn't the money. It was the final entry, written in my grandmother's shaky hand just 6 months ago. Terrence thinks he's selling the house. Let him sell the shell. The pearl belongs to the daughter who stayed. I closed the ledger. I felt a strange, cold clarity. Terrence hadn't just stolen a house. He had sold a Vance Holdings LLC property that didn't actually include the ground it sat on. He had sold a hollow box to a developer who was about to find out that he couldn't dig a single inch into that dirt without my permission. I walked out of the bank and into the sunlight. My phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered. "Is this Beverly Hollowell?" A man's voice, sharp and agitated. "It is." "This is Marcus Thorne. I'm standing here at the Hollowell property with your brother. There seems to be a situation with the local authorities. Your brother claims you're interfering with a legal sale." "Mr. Thorne," I said, leaning against my car, watching a hawk circle in the distance. "My brother has sold you the rights to a house and a few inches of topsoil. I suggest you check the mineral rights registry in the Chatham County Courthouse before you cut another check. And tell Terrence to stay off the porch. The police are there at my request because, as of this morning, the estate is under a federal audit." There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. "What do you want, Miss Hollowell?" Thorne asked, his voice suddenly much quieter. "I want what's mine," I said. "And I want my family to learn the difference between being a foundation and being a floor. I hung up. I had been the floor for 50 years. I had let them walk all over me, wipe their feet on me, and take my stability for granted. But a foundation? A foundation is what holds everything up. And if the foundation decides to shift, the whole house comes down. I got in my car and began the drive back to the house. It was time for the final service for Hattie Mae Hollowell. It wouldn't be in a church, and there wouldn't be any fried chicken. It was going to be a masterclass in the quiet, elegant power of a woman who had finally found her worth. The drive back to the Hollowell home felt shorter than it ever had before. Perhaps it's because, for the first time in my life, I wasn't driving toward a burden. I was driving toward a reckoning. As I rounded the final bend of the red dirt road, the scene looked like a low-budget movie set. 2 Chatham County Sheriff's cruisers were parked at angled intervals near the porch, their blue and red lights off, but their presence vibrating in the heat. Marcus Thorne's silver Mercedes sat like a gleaming surgical instrument in the middle of the yard, completely out of place against the weathered siding of the house. Terrence was on the porch, pacing like a caged animal. He had changed into a sweat-stained undershirt and a pair of old slacks. Aunt Reba was fanning herself with a church program in a rocking chair, and Cassandra was sitting on the steps, her head in her hands. The moment my SUV slowed to a halt, the air in the yard seemed to tighten. I sat in the car for a moment, checking my reflection in the visor mirror. I reapplied my lipstick, a shade called Power, that was just a few notes shy of blood red. I smoothed my linen jacket. I waited until the silence became uncomfortable for them before I opened the door. The Georgia heat hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't let it show. I walked across the grass, my heels sinking slightly into the earth that I now knew I truly owned. "Beverly!" Terrence shouted, jumping off the porch. He made to move toward me, but a deputy, a young man named Miller whose mother I'd gone to school with, stepped forward and placed a hand on his belt. "Easy, Mr. Hollowell," Miller said. "Let the lady walk." Terrence stopped, his chest heaving. "She's the one! She's the one who called you! She's trying to kick us out of our own house!" I ignored him. I walked straight to the man standing by the Mercedes. Marcus Thorne was exactly as I remembered him from the downtown Savannah gala. Mid-50s, impeccably tailored, with the eyes of a man who viewed the world as a series of obstacles to be paved over. "Mr. Thorne," I said, extending a hand. "I'm Beverly Hollowell. I believe we have some matters of title to discuss." Thorne didn't take my hand immediately. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and new curiosity. "Your brother represented himself as the sole executor and the majority stakeholder in Vance Holdings, Miss Hollowell. He produced a deed signed and notarized yesterday." "My brother produced a deed for the surface structure and the topsoil," I said, my voice projecting just enough for the family on the porch to hear. "But as I mentioned on the phone, he sold you a house without a foundation. The mineral rights to this 3-acre plot were severed in 1955. They are held by a trust that was never part of the general estate." "What is she talking about, Marcus?" Terrence yelled from the steps. "She's lying. She's just trying to stall the sale. I have the papers." Marcus Thorne turned his head slowly toward my brother. The look on his face was one of pure, icy disdain. "The papers you showed me, Terrence, didn't include a mineral search, because you told me there were no encumbrances. If your sister is right, You've sold me a liability, not an asset." "I'm right," I said. I pulled a folder from my leather briefcase and handed it to Thorne. "This is a certified copy of the 1955 deed severance, and this," I pulled out a second document, "is the current tax assessment for the limestone shelf. You'll note the state's preliminary easement request for the highway expansion. They can't move forward with the bridge support without purchasing the mineral rights from the trust." Thorne flipped through the pages. The more he read, the more the color drained from his face. Not because he was losing, but because he realized he had been outplayed by the wrong Hollowell. "You've been sitting on this," Thorne whispered, looking up at me. "My grandfather sat on it," I corrected. I simply respected his patience. Aunt Reba stood up, her fanning motion stopping abruptly. "Beverly Jeanette, what are you doing? That man is supposed to give us the check today. We already talked about how we were going to split it. Cassandra needs that money for her house, and Terrence has debts." "Terrence always has debts, Aunt Reba," I said, finally looking at her. "And Cassandra has a mother who has been her personal ATM for 15 years. The check you're waiting for was based on a lie. Terrence tried to sell something that wasn't his to give." "It's family land!" Cassandra cried out, standing up. Tears were streaming down her face. "Why can't you just let us have this one thing, Bev? You have the career. You have the money. You have everything. Why do you have to take this from us, too?" I walked toward the porch. The deputy moved aside to let me pass. I stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at my sister, the woman I had shielded from every storm, only to have her join the mob the moment it looked like I might be in her way. "I'm not taking anything from you, Cassandra," I said softly. "I am simply refusing to let you steal it from the memory of the woman we just buried. Do you think Grandma would have wanted this land turned into a strip of asphalt and a Thorne Estate sign? She spent 50 years protecting this dirt, and you were willing to sell it for a down payment on a lifestyle you haven't earned." "You think you're so much better than us," Terrence spat, walking up behind me. He smelled of stale beer and desperation. "Just because you have a suit and a title. You're just a mean, bitter woman who couldn't even make it to her own grandmother's funeral. That's what people are going to remember, Bev, not your deeds. They're going to remember that you weren't there." That was the cut, the one they all used. The strong black woman doesn't have feelings, so you can't hurt her with logic. You have to hurt her with her own heart. You have to tell her she's a failure as a daughter, a sister, a woman, because she dared to prioritize her own life. I turned to him. I didn't scream. I didn't raise my hand. I simply leaned in, close enough to see the broken capillaries in his eyes. "The reason I wasn't at the funeral, Terrence, is because you stole my time. You moved the date because you knew if I were there, I'd see Marcus Thorne in the pews, and I'd know exactly what you were doing. You used our grandmother's death as a smokescreen for your greed. And you want to talk about what people will remember?" I looked at the neighbors who were starting to gather at the edge of the property. I looked at the deputies. People will remember that on the day Hattie Mae was laid to rest, her grandson was busy signing away her legacy in a dark house with no power. They'll remember that his own sister had to call the police to keep him from committing fraud. I looked back at Marcus Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, I'm sure your legal team will advise you to void the contract with Vance Holdings immediately. If I were you, I'd be more concerned with the fact that Terrence accepted a earnest money wire from you based on false representations. That's a felony in this state. Thorne's eyes snapped to Terrence. How much was the wire, Marcus? I asked. 50,000, Thorne said, his voice like a guillotine. The silence that followed was deafening. $50,000. For Terrence, it was a fortune. For Thorne, it was a rounding error. But for the law, it was a prison sentence. Terrence? Aunt Reba whispered. You got $50,000? You told me you only got $5 for the expenses. The betrayal within the betrayal. It was almost poetic. Terrence had even been cheating the people who had helped him cheat me. Terrence backed away, his hands shaking. I was going to give you the rest after the closing, Reba. I swear. There isn't going to be a closing, Thorne said. He began walking toward his car. Miss Hollowell, expect a call from my attorneys. We'll need to discuss the mineral rights. I'm still interested in the development, but we'll be doing it on your terms, not his. I look forward to it, I said. Thorne got into his Mercedes and drove away, the gravel spraying beneath his tires. The yard was left in a heavy, humid silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant sound of a tractor. The deputies looked at me, then at Terrence. Do you want to press charges, Miss Hollowell? Deputy Miller asked. I looked at Terrence. He looked small. He looked like the boy who used to hide in the cornfields when he'd done something wrong, waiting for me to find him and tell him everything was going to be okay. For 40 years, I had been finding him. For 40 years, I had been the one to fix the broken vase, to pay the debt, to smooth over the lie. I looked at Aunt Reba, who was now weeping into her program, not for Hattie Mae, but for the money that had just vanished. I looked at Cassandra, who couldn't even meet my gaze. I felt a sudden, profound exhaustion. Not the kind that a night's sleep can fix. It was the exhaustion of a soul that had been used as a bridge for too many people who never intended to cross over to the other side. No, I said. I don't want to press charges. Terrence let out a visible breath of relief. He even started to smirk. See? I told you! She wouldn't! However, I interrupted, my voice cutting through his arrogance like a cold blade. I am the executor of the original, valid will that was in the cedar chest, the one I had a digital copy of in my safe in Charlotte. That will gives me the authority to manage all estate assets until they are settled. As of right now, this house is being boarded up for an official appraisal and audit. You have 1 hour to gather your things and vacate the premises. What? Aunt Reba shrieked. You're putting us out? Where are we supposed to go? You have your own home, Aunt Reba. And Cassandra, you have the condo I paid for. As for Terrence, I suggest he uses whatever is left of that $50,000 to find a place, because Mr. Thorne is going to be coming for that money, and I won't be the one helping you pay it back. You can't do this, Beverly! Terrence screamed, stepping toward me again. This time, Deputy Miller didn't just put a hand on his belt. He stepped between us and pulled his handcuffs from his pouch. That's enough, Terrence, Miller said. Your sister is being more than generous. You want to go to jail today, or you want to go pack? Terrence froze. The reality of the situation finally settled into his bones. The sister who always fixed it was gone. In her place was a woman who was simply finished. I didn't stay to watch them pack. I didn't want to see the way they would inevitably steal the small things, the silver spoons, the old clocks, the bits of Hattie Mae's life they would try to pawn for a few dollars. I walked to my car. "Beverly!" I stopped with my hand on the door. It was Cassandra. She had run down the steps and was standing a few feet away. She looked younger somehow, stripped of her entitlement. "Are you really just going to leave us like this?" she asked. "We're family." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the girl I'd taught to read. I saw the woman I'd supported through 3 failed careers. "We are family, Cassandra," I said. "But family isn't a suicide pact. I've spent my whole life being the strong one, so you all could afford to be weak. I've been the unbreakable one, so you all could be fragile. But the thing about being a pillar is that no one ever notices when the pillar starts to crack until the roof falls in." I pointed to the house. "The roof has fallen in, Cassandra, and for the first time in my life, I'm not going to be the one to build it back up. I'm going to go home, and I'm going to sit in the quiet. And if you want to be in my life, you're going to have to find a way to be a sister, not a customer." I got into my car and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked in the mirror. I saw the house, the dark, silent house of my childhood. I saw my brother sitting on the steps, his head in his hands. I saw Aunt Reba carrying a box to her car. I felt a tear finally prick my eye, but I didn't let it fall. Not yet. I drove past the cemetery one last time. I stopped the car and walked to the fresh mound of earth where Grandma was laid. The flowers I'd left on the pavement yesterday were gone, likely taken by the groundskeeper. I stood there for a long time. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows over the headstones. "I kept the foundation, Grandma," I whispered. "But I think I'm going to let the house go." I realized then that the real legacy wasn't the land. It wasn't the mineral rights or the limestone. It was the realization that I didn't have to be the backbone of a family that refused to stand on its own 2 feet. My grace wasn't in my endurance. It was in my exit. I was halfway back to Charlotte when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know where the rest of the records are, the ones your grandfather hid from the county. Meet me at the old smokehouse on Tuesday. Eloise." I gripped the steering wheel. The story wasn't over. My grandfather hadn't just been protecting the land from the state. He had been protecting it from something much closer to home. And as the lights of the city began to appear on the horizon, I knew I would be back. Not as the provider, not as the savior, but as the owner of my own destiny. The silence of my penthouse in Charlotte was usually my sanctuary. It was a space designed for a woman who valued precision. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's skyline, cream boucle furniture that never saw a stray crumb, and a kitchen that looked more like an art gallery than a place where meals were made. I had spent 15 years building this fortress of glass and steel, telling myself that every square inch of it was a testament to my independence. But as I stood by the window on Monday night, a glass of untouched Pinot Noir in my hand, the reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. I looked at the woman in the silk robe, the CEO, the benefactor, the unbreakable foundation, and for the first time, I saw the cracks. My phone had been vibrating on the marble island for 3 hours. It wasn't just my family anymore. The ripples of the funeral disaster had reached the Charlotte social circles and the upper echelons of the Canaan Baptist Church network. I finally picked it up. A dozen missed calls from Pastor Julian Reed of Savannah, 3 from the head of the Mothers Board, and a barrage of notifications from a family Facebook group I hadn't checked in months. I opened the app. A photo had been posted 2 hours ago. It was a shot of the Hollowell house, dark and boarded up. The caption, written by Aunt Reba, read, "When success turns your heart to stone. My sister's children and I are currently sleeping in a motel because Beverly decided her bank account was more important than her grandmother's legacy. Pray for her soul. She's lost her way." The comments below were a tidal wave of performative piety. Lord have mercy, not Hattie Mae's granddaughter. I always knew she was cold. Money changes people. How can she sleep in that high-rise knowing her blood is in a Motel 6? I set the phone down face first. This was the tax. This was the specific, agonizing price of being a successful African-American woman who finally says no. If you are the one who provides, you are a queen. The moment you stop providing, you are a traitor to the race, the family, and the faith. They don't see the years of mortgage payments, the tuition checks, or the hospital bills. They only see the moment you stopped being a fountain and became a person with boundaries. I walked to my office and opened my laptop. I didn't cry. I didn't go live to tell my side. I did what I do best. I followed the paper trail. I began pulling my personal credit reports and the secondary filings for the Hollowell estate. If Terrence had the audacity to create Vance Holdings LLC, I needed to see what else he'd put in my name, or Grandma's. An hour into the search, I felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Terrence hadn't just tried to sell the land. 3 months ago, while I was sitting in the hospice room holding Grandma's hand, a series of loans had been taken out in the name of Hattie Mae Hollowell. High-interest, predatory bridge loans totaling nearly $80,000. The collateral for those loans? My Charlotte penthouse. I leaned back in my chair, the breath leaving my lungs in a sharp hiss. He had used a forged power of attorney, likely the same one he'd used to try and sell the house to Marcus Thorne, to list me as a co-guarantor. Because I had authorized him to handle small household expenses and given him access to a secondary account for Grandma's care, he had been able to piggyback onto my credit profile. He hadn't just stolen the past. He was actively trying to cannibalize my future. I realized then that Terrence's desperation wasn't just about greed. He was drowning. And in his mind, it was perfectly acceptable to pull me under with him because I had enough to share. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "Bev, it's Marcus Thorne. We need to talk. Off the record. I think your brother has gotten himself into something much deeper than a bad land deal. Meet me tomorrow at the smokehouse with Eloise. I'll be there at noon." The smokehouse. The same place Eloise mentioned. I didn't sleep. I spent the night drafting revocation orders for every account I'd ever touched that had a Hollowell name on it. I sent 3 emails to my private investigators. Then, I packed a small bag. Not the silk suits this time. I put on a pair of sturdy dark jeans, a black turtleneck, and a pair of boots. I was going back to the red clay. But this time, I wasn't going as the granddaughter who was coming to say goodbye. I was going as the woman who was coming to reclaim her name. Tuesday in Georgia was a different kind of heat. It was a thick, wet weight that clung to your skin, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. I drove my SUV through the backwoods of Chatham County, bypassing the main house entirely. The old smokehouse sat at the very edge of the property, tucked into a grove of ancient weeping willows. It was a small, leaning structure of scorched cedar, built by my great-grandfather after the First World War. It was the only building on the land that hadn't been touched by renovations or paint in 60 years. When I pulled up, Eloise's rusted Buick was already there. Beside it sat Marcus Thorne's Mercedes. Eloise was sitting on a stump, fanning herself with a newspaper. Marcus was standing near the door of the smokehouse, looking profoundly uncomfortable in his $5,000 suit as a dragonfly circled his head. "You came," Marcus said, his voice stripped of the arrogance he'd had on the porch. "I didn't come for you, Marcus," I said, stepping out of the car. I looked at Eloise. "What are we doing here, Miss Eloise? Why did he have to be here?" "Because Marcus's daddy wasn't the only one who wanted this land," Eloise said, standing up with a groan. "And because Marcus has something in his pocket that belongs to you. Show her, Marcus." Marcus Thorne reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a digital recorder. He pressed play. A voice filled the quiet grove. It was Terrence. But it wasn't the loud, blustering Terrence I knew. He sounded terrified. "I told you, I'll get the signature. Beverly is distracted with the hospice nurses. She's signing everything I put in front of her for the house accounts. Just give me another week. If the Thorne deal doesn't go through, I have the other buyers." Then a second voice, low, gravelly, and dangerous. "The Thorne deal is the only deal, Terrence. We need that limestone shelf for the waste management contracts. If you don't deliver the mineral rights, we don't just take the house. We take the sister. I hear she's got a very nice place in Charlotte. Maybe she'd like some new roommates." The recording clicked off. "Who was that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Vance Holdings wasn't just Terrence," Marcus said, stepping closer. "It was a shell company set up by a group out of Atlanta. They specialize in land grabs, finding heirs to historic Black-owned property who are in debt, bailing them out, and then using them to force a sale of the entire tract, usually for industrial use. They wanted to turn this acreage into a private landfill annex." I looked at the house in the distance. A landfill. They wanted to bury my grandmother's legacy under the city's trash. "They used Terrence's gambling debts to leverage him," Marcus continued. "He's been working for them for 18 months. He didn't just move the funeral to keep you away, Beverly. He moved it because they told him if the deed wasn't signed by Friday, they were going to visit you in Charlotte." I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a searing, white-hot anger. Terrence hadn't just been greedy. He had been a coward. He had traded my safety for his own skin. "Why are you telling me this, Marcus?" I asked. "You were going to buy it from them." "I was going to buy it to develop it," Marcus said, looking at the smokehouse. "My father was a lot of things, Beverly, but he wasn't a monster. He wanted this land because he respected what your grandfather built. When I realized these guys were planning to turn it into a dump, and that they were using your brother to threaten you, I realized I was on the wrong side of the table." He paused, his eyes drifting to the smokehouse door. "And because of what's inside there." Eloise walked to the door of the smokehouse. It was held shut by a heavy, rusted iron latch. She looked at me. "Your grandfather knew the highway was coming, but he also knew the people who would come with it. He knew that one day, a Hollowell man would be weak enough to sell the family out." She pulled a key from her pocket, the brass one she'd shown me before, and fitted it into a hidden lock beneath the main latch. The door creaked open. The interior of the smokehouse was cool and smelled of salt and ancient wood. In the center of the room, beneath a heavy tarp, sat a large, rectangular object. I walked forward and pulled back the tarp. I expected more papers. I expected gold or maybe more deeds. It was a printing press. A small, hand-cranked 1940s-era press. And beside it, neatly stacked in wooden crates, were thousands of pages of newsprint. "What is this?" I asked, running my hand over the cold metal. It's the Savannah Sentinel, Eloise said, her voice trembling with pride. The paper your grandfather ran in secret for 20 years. He didn't just survey the land, Beverly. He used this press to document every illegal land seizure, every crooked sheriff, and every bribe taken by the developers in this county from 1950 to 1970. I picked up one of the yellowed pages. The headline read, "The Ghost Deeds: How the County Council is Stealing the Heights." He didn't just hide the mineral rights, Marcus whispered. He hid the evidence. This room is a graveyard of every political career in this region. My father's name is in those crates. So are the names of the men currently threatening your brother. I looked at the crates. My grandfather hadn't just left me money. He had left me a weapon. The men in Atlanta, I said, turning to Marcus. They're the sons of the men in these papers, aren't they? Exactly, Marcus said. They've been trying to get this land for 70 years because they know the Sentinel archives are buried here somewhere. They thought it was under the house. They never thought to look in the one place that was too worthless to renovate. I looked at the press, then at the mountain of evidence. I finally understood the Matriarch's grace. It wasn't about being quiet and enduring. It was about knowing exactly when to reveal the truth that would burn the whole crooked system down. Terrence thinks he's in debt, I said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. He has no idea what he's actually owed. I turned to Marcus. You want to be on the right side of the table? Then you're going to help me. We're not going to sell the mineral rights to the state. We're going to trade them. For what? Marcus asked. For the names of every man who put a lien on my house, I said. And for a front row seat when I reboot the Sentinel for the digital age. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a call from Terrence. I answered. Bev? He sounded frantic. Bev, please. You have to help me. They're at the motel. They say they're going to Charlotte if I don't give them the cedar chest. They think I have the files. I told them you have them. Please, just give them what they want. I looked at the printing press. I looked at the legacy of a man who had risked everything to tell the truth. I'm not giving them anything, Terrence, I said, my voice as calm as a graveyard. And I suggest you stop talking, because I'm about to do exactly what Grandma told me to do. What? What did she tell you? She told me to keep the foundation, I said. And you, Terrence, are part of the rot that needs to be cleared away. I hung up. I looked at Eloise. How fast can we get these crates to my car? We don't need your car, honey, Eloise said, pointing to the back of the smokehouse. Your grandfather built a cellar under this floor. It's got its own ventilation and its own exit into the woods. We just need to move the press. As we began to work, I felt a strange sense of peace. The exhaustion was gone. The strong black woman who carried everyone else's weight was dead. In her place was a woman who was finally carrying her own power. But as we moved the heavy metal press, I saw something lodged in the gears. A small, modern envelope. It was fresh. It wasn't from 1950. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of me, taken 3 days ago, sitting by Grandma's bed in the hospice. On the back, in a handwriting I didn't recognize, were 4 words. The price has changed. I looked at Marcus. He saw the photo. His face went white. "That's not from the Atlanta group," he whispered. That's the local council's seal on the back of that photo." The betrayal went even higher than I thought. It wasn't just developers. It was the very people I had grown up with, the people who sat in the pews at Canaan Baptist. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for land. I was fighting for my life. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had assumed that because I was a lady, I didn't know how to go to war. They were about to find out that the matriarch doesn't just hold the line, she defines where the line is drawn. And anyone on the wrong side of it was about to be erased. The photograph felt like a shard of ice in the center of my palm. In the picture, I am leaning over Grandma's hospital bed, my forehead pressed against her hand. My eyes are closed, my face stripped of the Beverly the Executive mask. I look small. I look vulnerable. I look like a daughter losing her world. The fact that someone was in that room, or peering through the glass, waiting for the exact moment my armor fell to click a shutter, it was a violation that transcended land and money. It was a theft of my grief. "The local council seal," I said, my voice barely audible above the hum of the cicadas. I turned the photo over, staring at the faint embossed stamp of the Chatham County Planning Commission. They weren't just waiting for her to die, Marcus. They were documenting my negligence while I was with her. They wanted proof that I was too emotionally compromised to be the executor. Marcus Thorne looked at the photo and then at the dark, leaning walls of the smokehouse. For the first time, the polished developer looked afraid. "Beverly, if the council is involved, this isn't a land deal anymore. It's a clearance. They've already zoned this for the waste project. The highway expansion is just the excuse. They need the limestone shelf to stabilize the heavy load pits." I looked at Eloise. She was standing by the crates, her eyes ancient and knowing. "They think they're burying trash," she said, "but they're trying to bury the ghosts of what they did to get this far. Your grandfather's papers in these crates? They name the grandfathers of the men on that council today. It's a lineage of theft, Beverly, and you're the last one holding the receipt." "We have to move these," I said, my mind shifting into high-gear corporate crisis mode. "Now. Marcus, do you still have that transport company on retainer? The one you used for the Savannah Gallery project?" "I do. But, Beverly, if we move these archives now, we're tipping our hand. They'll know we found the smokehouse cache." "They already know," I said, holding up the photo. "The price has changed. They're coming for my home in Charlotte. They're coming for my reputation. I'm not playing defense anymore." I walked out of the smokehouse, the Georgia sun blinding me for a second. I looked toward the main house. I could see the silhouette of a black SUV parked at the end of the long driveway. Not a sheriff's car. Just a quiet, idling observer. They weren't hiding anymore. They were waiting for me to break. "Eloise, go back to your house," I commanded. My voice had the resonance of a gavel. "Lock your doors. I'm sending 2 of my private security detail from Charlotte to sit on your porch. Tell them you're my aunt. Don't answer the phone for anyone but me." "Beverly Jeanette, I've lived through the Klan and the riots," Eloise said, pulling her cardigan tight. "I ain't afraid of a man in a suit." "It's not the suit you should fear, Miss Eloise. It's the pen. They're trying to rewrite our history, and I need you alive to tell the real version. I turned to Marcus. Get your trucks here. Tell them it's an emergency salvage of historic documents for the Savannah Historical Society. Give them a premium. I want these crates in a climate-controlled, high-security facility by midnight. Not in Savannah, in Atlanta. At the vault I use for my firm's physical backups. Marcus nodded, already dialing his phone. And what about you? Where are you going? I looked at the black SUV at the end of the drive. I'm going to church, I said. Canaan Baptist was more than a building. It was the social ledger of the county. If you were erased from the rolls of Canaan, you were erased from the community. As I pulled into the paved lot, the mother's board was just finishing their Tuesday afternoon tea. These were the women who had seen me grow up. They were the women who had praised Hattie Mae for raising such a strong, successful daughter. Now, they were the women who were likely whispering about my cold heart over their porcelain cups. I stepped out of the car. I had taken off the black turtleneck and put on a crisp, navy blue silk blouse and a gold monogram necklace, my grandfather's initials. I carried my head high, my posture a study in restrained power. As I entered the fellowship hall, the clinking of teaspoons stopped. Aunt Reba was there. She was sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Sister Watkins and Mother Greer. She had a tissue tucked into her sleeve, her face a mask of tragic suffering. "Beverly," Reba said, her voice trembling with a rehearsed frailty. "I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you'd be halfway back to your high-rise by now, after what you did to us at the house." The other women looked at me with varying degrees of pity and condemnation. "I'm here to speak with Pastor Reed," I said, my voice calm and projecting to the back of the room. "But since you're all here, I think it's time we had a conversation about the legacy of Hattie Mae Hollowell." "You have no right to use her name," Mother Greer snapped, her voice like a dry twig snapping. "Not after you turned your brother and sister out into the street. Not after you put boards on that house. That house was a refuge for this community." "That house," I said, stepping closer to the table, "was being used as collateral for a criminal land grab that would have turned this entire parish into a dumping ground for the city's industrial waste. Did my brother tell you that?" The room went silent. Reba's eyes darted to the side. He said it was for development, for luxury homes." "He lied," I said. I pulled out a copy of the zoning application I had downloaded that morning. I laid it on the table over the lace cloth. "This is the application for the Vance Holdings Environmental Annex. Look at the board of directors, Reba. Look at the names." Sister Watkins put on her spectacles and leaned in. She gasped. That's Councilman Miller's son, and the mayor's brother-in-law." "They used Terrence's gambling debts to trick him into signing away the land," I continued, my voice steady, eyes locked on Reba. "And when they realized I held the mineral rights, the rights that would prevent them from digging their pits, they decided to use you, Aunt Reba. They used your Facebook post. They used your grief to try and shame me into silence." Reba turned a ghostly shade of gray. I didn't know about no trash pits, Beverly. Terrence says whatever the person holding his leash tells him to say," I interrupted. "But you, Auntie, you've lived here 70 years. You know the history of this soil. You know what it cost Grandpa to keep it. And yet, for a few $1,000s in expense money, You were willing to help them paint me as a villain so they could strip mine our history. I looked around the room at the mothers of the church, the women who were the moral compass of our world. You all talk about family loyalty, I said. But where was the loyalty when I was the only one paying the taxes on this church's outreach center for the last 5 years? Where was the family when Hattie Mae needed 24-hour care and I was the only one who didn't have a conflict with my schedule? You've mistaken my silence for weakness. You've mistaken my success for a bank account you're entitled to raid. I leaned down, my face inches from Reba's. The boards stay on the house, Reba, not to keep you out, but to keep the vultures from taking what's left of Grandma's dignity. And as for the motel, I've already paid for 2 weeks of a suite for you and Cassandra. Not because you deserve it, but because I am a Hollowell, and we don't leave our own in the dirt, even when they're the ones who dug the hole. I stood up straight, smoothing my blouse. If anyone has anything else to say about my cold heart, please say it now, or forever hold your peace while I save this community from the poison you are about to let into the water table. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. No one spoke. Mother Greer looked down at her tea. Sister Watkins pulled the zoning paper toward her, her hand shaking. I turned and walked toward the pastor's office. Pastor Julian Reed was waiting behind his desk. He was a man of 60, with a silver beard and eyes that had seen too many strong women break under the pressure of being the only ones holding the rope. "I heard the commotion, Beverly," he said softly. "I'm sure you did, Pastor. The walls in the fellowship hall have always been thin." "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, leaning forward. "The men on that council, they don't just own the land. They own the law in this county. They can make your life very difficult in Charlotte. I've already received calls asking about your stability as an executor." "I'm not playing a game, Pastor. I'm conducting an audit." I sat down across from him. "And I need the church's records from 1958, the year the Deacons Fund was used to buy the North Side acreage." Reed froze. "Beverly, those records are sensitive." "They're the key," I said. "My grandfather's archives mention a hush fund that was paid by the county to the church to keep the congregation from protesting the first highway split. I want to know whose names were on those checks, because I suspect the grandsons of those deacons are the ones sitting on the council today, trying to finish what their grandfathers started." Reed looked at me for a long time. I didn't blink. I didn't fidget. I sat there with the quiet sovereignty of a woman who knew she was the only thing standing between the truth and a lie. "Hattie Mae used to say you were the steel in the family's spine," Reed whispered. I see she wasn't exaggerating. He stood up, walked to a heavy iron safe in the corner, and began turning the dial. "If I give you these, Beverly, there's no going back. You'll be tearing down the pillars of this entire community. Families who have been respected for generations will be ruined." "The pillars are already rotten, Pastor," I said. "They're just painted white to look clean. I'd rather live in the rubble of the truth than in a house built on a graveyard." He pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger, the kind with yellowed pages and the scent of old tobacco. He placed it on the desk. "Your grandfather was a good man, Beverly, but he was a lonely man. He knew that one day you'd be the only one strong enough to open this book." I took the ledger. As I touched the cover, my phone buzzed. A text from my security detail in Charlotte. "Ma'am, someone just bypassed the service elevator in your building. They're at your front door. We're engaging now. Stay where you are. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but I didn't panic. I looked at the ledger, then at the photo of me and Grandma. They weren't just coming for my land anymore. They were trying to take my home while I was standing in God's house. Pastor, I said, tucking the ledger under my arm, I need to borrow your car. Mine is being watched. Where are you going? To find my brother, I said. It's time he understands that the only thing worse than being in debt to a developer is being in debt to a sister who is done being unbreakable. I found Terrence at a dive bar on the outskirts of the county line, a place where the shadows were thick and the beer was cheap enough to forget your own name. He was sitting in a booth in the back, a half-empty pitcher in front of him. When he saw me walk in, he didn't even try to run. He just looked at me with a hollow, haunted expression. They're in your apartment, Bev, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm sorry. They said they just wanted the files. They said if I gave them the key code, they'd leave you alone. They'd wipe my debt. I walked over and sat down across from him. I didn't hit him. I didn't scream. I just looked at him with the cold, analytical gaze of a woman who was looking at a bad investment. The key code you gave them was for the guest suite, Terrence, I said. The one that's currently occupied by 2 former Mossad agents I hired to guard my data. By the time your friends realize they've been trapped in a 400-square-foot vacuum-sealed panic room, the Charlotte PD will be waiting for them. Terrence's jaw dropped. You knew? I've been 5 steps ahead of you since the moment I saw those white lilies on the pavement, Terrence. You think you're a player, but you're just a pawn. And the problem with being a pawn is that you're the first thing sacrificed to save the king. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper. The council isn't going to save you. They're going to kill you, Terrence. Because you're the only witness who can link them to the forged deeds. You're the loose end they're planning to snip once the land is clear. Terrence began to shake. What do I do? Bev, please. I'm your brother. You can't let them... I'm not going to let them do anything, I said. But from this moment on, you are no longer a Hollowell. You are a state's witness. You are going to go to the FBI field office in Savannah. You are going to tell them everything about Vance Holdings. You're going to tell them about the council. And in exchange, I might decide not to testify against you for the identity theft. The FBI? Terrence gasped. Bev, they'll put me in prison. Prison is safer than a Georgia swamp, Terrence. And it's a lot more than you deserve after you violated Grandma's deathbed. I stood up. I felt a strange, cold lightness. The burden of being his protector had finally, completely dissolved. I'm going back to the house now, I said. I'm going to sit on the porch of the house you tried to sell. And I'm going to wait for the council to come to me. You're crazy, Terrence said. They'll kill you. No, I said, looking at the church ledger in my hand. They're going to beg me, because I'm the only one who can keep their grandfathers from being remembered as thieves. I walked out of the bar and into the night. The air was finally cooling. I could smell the rain coming, a storm that would wash away the red dust and the lies. I was a matriarch, not because I had a family that loved me, but because I was the only one left who knew how to hold the line. As I drove back toward the Hollowell property, I saw the lights of the black SUV following me. I didn't speed up. I didn't slow down. I just reached into my bag, pulled out my grandmother's pearls, and looped them around my neck. The grace was over. The rain had begun. The boards on the Hollowell house looked like scars in the moonlight. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning beneath my heels, a familiar greeting from a structure that had held my secrets since I was 6 years old. I didn't turn on the porch light. I didn't need to. I knew every splinter of this place. I pulled a folding chair from the corner, the one Grandma used to sit in when she watched the fireflies, and placed it directly in front of the door. I sat down, the church ledger heavy in my lap, and waited. The black SUV didn't wait long. It pulled into the tall grass at the edge of the drive, its headlights cutting through the dark like twin searchlights before clicking off. The engine died, and the night air rushed back in, thick with the sound of crickets. A door opened. A man stepped out. He wasn't a thug. He wasn't a hired hand. He was wearing a seersucker suit that cost more than my first car, and his hair was a perfect, dignified silver. Councilman Arthur Miller III, the grandson of the man who had signed the first hush fund check in 1958. "Beverly," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. He walked toward the porch with the casual confidence of a man who owned the air he breathed. "It's a long way from Charlotte. You shouldn't be out here alone at this hour. It isn't safe." "Safety is a relative term, Arthur," I said. I didn't get up. I didn't offer him a seat. "I find that I'm much safer on this porch than I am in a boardroom full of men who think my grandfather's land is their inheritance." Miller stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at the boards on the windows, then up at me. "Your brother is a troubled man, Beverly. He made some promises to some very impatient people, promises he couldn't keep. We're just trying to find a solution that keeps the Hollowell name out of the headlines." "Is that why you sent men to bypass the elevator in my building today?" I asked, my voice as cold as deep well water. "To keep my name out of the headlines?" Miller's expression didn't flicker. "I have no idea what you're talking about. But I do know that you have some documents that belong to the county. Historical records. Things that were moved from the smokehouse today." I tapped the ledger in my lap. "You mean these? The records of how your grandfather, Arthur Miller Sr., used the Deacons Fund at Canaan Baptist to launder the state's payout for the 1960 highway bypass? The records that show he diverted 40% of the Community Development Fund into a private account in the Cayman Islands, an account that's still active today, currently being used to fund your re-election campaign?" The silence that followed was absolute. Miller's casual stance shifted. His shoulders tightened. The Southern gentleman mask slipped just enough to show the predator underneath. "Those records are county property," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your grandfather stole them when he was working as a surveyor's assistant. They are illegal copies." "My grandfather didn't steal them, Arthur. He archived them. He knew that one day, the men in this county would try to bury their crimes under the pretext of progress. He knew you'd come for the limestone shelf, but he also knew why you needed it so badly." I leaned forward, the light of the moon catching the pearls at my neck. "It's not just for a waste annex, is it? It's for the containment of the chemical runoff from the old mill site, the one your family owned until 1985, the one that leaked mercury into the water table for 20 years. You need the limestone to neutralize the soil before the EPA does their mandatory 10-year survey next spring. If they find that plume, The Miller estate will be bankrupt in a month. Miller stepped onto the first stair. You're smart, Beverly. I've always said that. You have that city polish. But you're forgetting one thing. You're in my county now. My sheriff, my judge, my soil. And you're on my porch, I countered. And unlike my brother, I don't have a gambling debt. I don't have a price. And I don't have a breaking point. I stood up slowly, clutching the ledger to my chest like a shield. Your men are currently being processed by the Charlotte-Mecklenburg police. They were caught on high-definition video attempting a home invasion. I've already forwarded a digital copy of this ledger to my legal team in Atlanta and the regional EPA office. The archive I found today is already being indexed by the University of Georgia's Historical Department as a donated collection. Miller's face twisted. You're destroying this community. You realize that? If you expose those families, the church falls. The businesses fall. The people you grew up with will lose everything. The people I grew up with have been living on a lie for 60 years, I said. They've been drinking poisoned water while you built a mansion on the hill. My grandmother died in this house, Arthur, and in her final days, she couldn't even drink the water from her own well because it smelled like sulfur. You knew. You've known for decades. I stepped to the edge of the porch, looking down at him. I've spent my life being the strong black woman everyone could lean on. I've carried my family's debts, their secrets, and their failures. I've been the one who fixed the broken things. But I realized something today, watching you pull up in that SUV. And what's that? Miller hissed. I realized that I'm not a bridge, I said. I'm a wall. And you just ran out of road. You think you can win? Miller laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. You're one woman, alone. Your family hates you. Your church is afraid of you. You have nothing but a book of old sins. I have the truth, I said. And in this world, that's the only thing that doesn't depreciate. I pulled my phone from my pocket and pressed a button. A voice filled the air, Miller's own voice from 30 seconds ago, admitted to the records being county property and his knowledge of the archives. I'm also a very good executive, Arthur. I never go into a meeting without a recording device. Miller lunged. He didn't make it to the top step. Two silhouettes stepped out from the shadows of the willow trees. They weren't deputies. They were the men I'd hired from Charlotte, the professionals who didn't care about county lines or seersucker suits. One of them caught Miller by the arm, twisting it behind his back with a clinical efficiency that made the councilman cry out. Careful, Arthur, I said, stepping back into the doorway. You're trespassing. And as I told my brother, I've decided to stop being generous with people who don't respect my boundaries. You won't get away with this, Miller groaned, his face pressed against the porch railing. The council will block the estate. You'll never sell an inch of this land. I'm not selling it, I said. I'm turning it into a conservancy. The Hattie Mae Hollowell Center for Environmental Justice. It turns out, when you own the mineral rights to a massive limestone shelf that the state desperately needs for highway safety, you can negotiate almost anything, including a permanent federal injunction against your waste annex. I looked at the men holding him. Take him to the end of the drive. If he's still on the property in 5 minutes, call the state troopers. Not the sheriff. The troopers. I watched them lead him away, his expensive shoes scuffing the red dirt. I watched the black SUV peel out, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly in the moonlight. The yard was quiet again. I turned and walked into the house. I used my flashlight to find my way to the kitchen. I sat at the table where I'd eaten 1,000 breakfasts. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness, the kind that hits when the battle is over and there's no one left to share the victory with. My brother was a traitor. My sister was a spectator. My aunt was a parasite. I had saved the land. I had saved the community. But I had lost the family I thought I was doing it for. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper I'd found in the ledger. It was a note, written in my grandfather's hand, dated the day I was born. For Beverly, the world will tell you that you are the foundation because you are strong. They will tell you that your job is to hold everyone else up. But remember, little girl, the foundation is the only part of the house that doesn't get to see the sun. Don't be the foundation. Be the light that shows them where the house is broken. I leaned my head back against the wall and finally, for the first time since I saw those white lilies, I let the tears come. They weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of shedding. I was shedding the expectation of being the strong Black woman. I was shedding the guilt of my own success. I was shedding the weight of people who only loved me when I was carrying them. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the house breathe. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Cassandra. Bev? The motel is nice. I'm sorry about the Facebook post. Terrence, he's gone to Savannah to talk to the feds. He told me everything. I'm scared, Bev. I don't know who we are without this house. I looked at the message. I didn't reply immediately. I thought about the look, the quiet, knowing gaze of a mother. I thought about the grace I was supposed to have. We are exactly who we choose to be, Cassandra, I typed back. The house was just boards and nails. The truth is what we live in now. Sleep well. I closed the phone. I walked to the front door and looked out at the 3 acres. My grandfather's land. My grandmother's legacy. My burden. I realized then that the matriarch's grace wasn't about holding the family together at any cost. It was about having the courage to let the rotten parts fall away so the healthy ones could finally grow. Tomorrow, the lawyers would arrive. Tomorrow, the press would start asking questions about the Savannah Sentinel archives. Tomorrow, the world would see the cracks in the pillars. But tonight, for the first time in 40 years, I wasn't the backbone. I was just Beverly, and the silence was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. The sun rose over the Georgia pines not with a herald of trumpets, but with a slow, bruising purple that bled into a humid gold. I was still sitting at the kitchen table. My suit was wrinkled, my pearls felt heavy around my neck, and the ledger remained closed before me like a tombstone. The house was beginning to wake up, not with the sound of family, the clatter of Grandma's cast-iron skillet, or the low hum of gospel music from the radio, but with the creaks of a structure that had been hollowed out. I stood up, my joints stiff, and walked to the sink. I turned the handle. A rusty brown trickle of water spat out before turning into a steady stream. I washed my face, the cold water shocking my skin. I looked into the small spotted mirror above the basin and didn't recognize the woman staring back. For decades, I had worn the mask of the provider. I had cultivated a look of unshakable grace. But today, the mask was gone. My eyes were bloodshot, and there was a sharpness to my jawline that I hadn't noticed before. I wasn't just tired. I was finished. A heavy knock at the back door vibrated through the floorboards. I didn't jump. I didn't rush to answer it. I dried my face with a paper towel and walked slowly to the door. I unlatched the heavy deadbolt I'd installed myself 3 years ago, back when I thought I was protecting Grandma from intruders, never realizing I was actually locking her in with her own family's greed. Aunt Reba stood on the back porch. She wasn't wearing her Sunday best today. She was in a faded housecoat, her hair wrapped in a silk scarf, her face devoid of the performative grief she'd worn at the church. She looked older, smaller, and profoundly bitter. "You really did it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice raspy. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me and sat at the table, the same table where she had sat for 50 years eating the food I paid for. "Good morning to you too, Reba," I said, closing the door. "Don't you good morning me, Beverly Jeanette. I just got a call from the bank. My debit card was declined at the Piggly Wiggly. They told me the authorized secondary account had been closed at midnight." She slammed her hand on the table. "I have no way to pay for my medicine. I have no way to get groceries for your sister's kids. What are you trying to do? Starve us?" I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. This was the transactional love phase. It always started with a crisis. It always ended with my checkbook. "I'm not trying to starve you, Reba," I said quietly. "I'm trying to introduce you to the reality of your own choices. You stood in that fellowship hall yesterday and called me a disgrace. You told the Mothers Board I was cold-hearted. You conspired with Terrence to sell the ground I'm standing on." "We were desperate!" Reba shouted, her voice cracking. "You don't know what it's like to worry about a light bill, Beverly. You don't know what it's like to wonder if you're going to have a roof over your head next month. You have that fancy condo and your fancy cars. You have more than you could ever spend." "I have what I worked for," I said. "And I have it because I spent 25 years making sure you never had to worry about a light bill. I've paid your mortgage since Uncle Silas died. I've paid for every car Cassandra has ever crashed. I've been the safety net for so long that you've forgotten that the net is made of my time, my youth, and my peace." I walked over and sat across from her. I didn't reach for her hand. I didn't offer her a cup of tea. "The account wasn't closed," I corrected her. "It was restricted. From now on, any money you receive from the Hollowell estate will be through a court-appointed trustee. I am removing myself as your personal banker. If you need medicine, you can submit the receipt to the trustee. If you need groceries, there is a weekly allowance. But the days of you using my credit profile to fund Terrence's gambling or your own vanity are over." Reba stared at me, her mouth agape. "You're putting us on an allowance? Like we're children?" "You've behaved like children," I said. "You've lived off the labor of a woman you don't even respect. You think because I'm strong, I don't feel the weight of your entitlement. You think because I don't scream, I'm not bleeding." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the smokehouse. "Grandma knew," I whispered. "She knew that if she left the land to all of you, you'd pick it clean like vultures. That's why she left me the mineral rights. She wasn't giving me a gift. She was giving me a shield. She knew I was the only one who wouldn't sell the bones of this family for a quick payout." Reba stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. "You think you've won, don't you? You think because you have the law on your side, you have the moral high ground. But you're going to be very lonely, Beverly. When you're sitting in that big house in Charlotte with nobody to call you on Christmas, nobody to visit you when you're sick, you're going to regret the day you decided to be right instead of being family." "I've been family for 40 years, Reba," I said, turning to face her. "And I've been lonely the entire time. I've been lonely in rooms full of people who only spoke to me when they needed a loan. I've been lonely at dinners where I was the one who cooked, cleaned, and paid, only to be ignored once the plates were empty." I stepped closer to her, my voice dropping to that lethal, quiet calm. "I'd rather be lonely in a house that belongs to me than be surrounded by people who view my presence as a transaction. Now, I have a meeting with the EPA and the state troopers. I suggest you go back to the motel and start looking at your own finances, because the Hollowell ATM is permanently out of service." Reba looked like she wanted to spit at me. For a second, the mask of the auntie fell away completely, revealing a deep, ugly resentment. "You always were Hattie Mae's favorite," she hissed. "She saw that coldness in you. She called it iron, but I always knew it was just ice. You're just like your grandfather, a man who'd rather hold a grudge than hold his kin." "My grandfather held the truth," I said. "And as it turns out, the truth is the only thing that doesn't rot." She stormed out of the house, slamming the screen door so hard the wood splintered. I sat back down at the table. My hands were shaking, but only slightly. The confrontation didn't leave me with the usual surge of guilt I felt whenever I disappointed the family. Instead, I felt a strange, clinical detachment. I was an architect looking at a condemned building. I wasn't angry at the termites. I was just ready to clear the site. I pulled my laptop from my bag and began the systematic process of quiet sovereignty. First, I logged into my corporate accounts. I removed Cassandra as a secondary cardholder on the emergency travel account. I saw that she had tried to charge a $1,200 spa day in Savannah just 2 hours ago. Declined. Next, I contacted my insurance agent. I removed my name from the co-signed policy on Terrence's truck, the one he hadn't made a payment on in 6 months. Then, I emailed the treasurer of Canaan Baptist. I informed them that my monthly tithe, the one that covered the church's landscaping and the youth center's electric bill, would be redirected to the Hattie Mae Hollowell Conservancy effective immediately. One by one, I cut the invisible threads that bound me to their dysfunction. Each click of the mouse felt like a stitch being removed from a wound I'd been keeping open for years. Around 10 a.m., a black and white state trooper vehicle pulled into the drive. Behind it was a white SUV with the EPA logo on the door. I went out to meet them. The lead investigator was a woman about my age, sharp, professional, with eyes that had seen enough corporate environmental crime to fill a library. Her name was Agent Sarah Vance, no relation to us, though the irony of the name wasn't lost on me. "Miss Hollowell," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "We received the digital files you sent to the Atlanta office. If even half of what's in those archives is verifiable, we're looking at one of the largest land use fraud cases in Georgia history." "It's all verifiable, Agent Vance," I said, leading them toward the smokehouse. "The physical ledger from the church and the Savannah Sentinel archives provide the names, the dates, and the account numbers. The limestone shelf beneath us is the proof of the motive. They needed to bury the mercury plume before the state began the highway foundation work. As we walked, I noticed the black SUV from the council was gone. Arthur Miller was likely in a frantic meeting with his attorneys right now, trying to figure out how to burn the secondary records he thought were safe in his own office. "Your brother," Agent Vance said, looking at the boarded-up house. "The FBI in Savannah says he's cooperating. He's naming names on the Vance Holdings board." "Terrence was a victim of his own weakness," I said, "but he was also a willing participant. I expect the law to treat him accordingly." "You're not going to ask for leniency?" she asked, surprised. "Leniency is what got us here," I said. "For 40 years, I gave my family leniency. I gave them second chances that they treated as entitlements. I'm not a prosecutor, Agent Vance. I'm a citizen who is tired of living in a world built on lies. Whatever happens to Terrence is a consequence of his own actions, not my lack of mercy." We spent the next 4 hours in the smokehouse. I watched as the EPA technicians began the process of soil sampling. I watched as the state troopers took custody of the physical crates, documenting each one with a camera. The weight of the secret was finally being transferred to the shoulders of the state. As the sun reached its zenith, I walked back to the main house. I sat on the porch steps, watching the government vehicles line the red dirt road. It looked like a funeral procession. The real funeral Hattie Mae deserved. A procession of truth. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Don't think this is over, Beverly. You can't kill a legacy with a ledger. A.M." Arthur Miller. He was still trying to play the game. He didn't realize that I wasn't playing anymore. I had flipped the table. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. I looked at my hands. They were blistered, not from the work of today, but from the years of holding the rope for a family that never intended to climb. I realized then that the rope wasn't there to save them. It was there to keep me tied to the ground. I stood up and walked into the house. I went to Grandma's bedroom. It was empty and quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled a small velvet box from my purse. I hadn't opened it since the night she died. Inside was a simple gold band, Grandma's wedding ring. She'd taken it off in her final days because her fingers had swollen. I slipped it onto my pinky finger. It was cold and heavy. "I'm letting the house go, Grandma," I whispered. At that moment, I heard the sound of another car pulling into the drive. It wasn't a police car. It was a familiar, battered sedan. Cassandra. I walked to the front door. My sister was standing by her car, looking up at the boarded windows. She looked exhausted. She looked like she'd been crying for hours. "Bev?" she called out, her voice small. "Can we talk? Please? Just us? No Reba, no Terrence?" I looked at her through the screen door. The sister I'd raised. The sister who had betrayed me. "I'm busy, Cassandra," I said. "I know you are. I know you're doing all this legal stuff. But I found something. In the motel room. Terrence left a bag behind when he fled to Savannah. There was a letter in it. From Mama. From before she died." I felt a sharp, cold prick of interest. Our mother had died 20 years ago. "A letter?" "It's addressed to you," Cassandra said, holding up a yellowed envelope. "Terrence had it the whole time. He told me he kept it because he didn't want you to get a big head. But I think you need to see it before you sign those papers with the EPA." I walked out onto the porch. My heart was thumping against my ribs. "Give it to me," I said. Cassandra walked up the steps and handed me the envelope. Her hand was shaking. I'm sorry, Bev, for everything. I didn't know he had this. I didn't know he was... I just thought you were being mean. I took the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakably our mother's, an elegant, looping script that I hadn't seen in 2 decades. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a key, a small, modern key to a storage unit in Savannah. The letter was short. Beverly, if you are reading this, it means the house is quiet and the burden has finally landed on your shoulders. I'm sorry I had to leave you with them. I'm sorry I didn't teach you how to be soft. But there is a secret your father kept, a secret that even Hattie doesn't fully know. Go to the unit. Look for the blue trunk. Don't let Arthur Miller find it first. I looked at Cassandra. She was watching me, her eyes wide. What does it say? She asked. I looked at the key in my hand. I looked at the EPA agents in the distance. The story wasn't about land or mercury or highway bypasses. It was about a bloodline. And I was about to find out exactly whose blood I was carrying. It says the house has a second basement, Cassandra, I whispered. And I think it's time we found out what's in it. The cliffhanger wasn't a discovery. It was a realization. The family I had been fighting wasn't just greedy. They were hiding a crime that went far deeper than a deed. And my mother had been the one holding the key. The key was cool in my palm, a small, jagged piece of silver that felt heavier than the ledger I had been clutching all night. I looked at Cassandra, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't see the sister who needed a handout. I saw a woman who was finally seeing the wreckage of the world our family had built. Get in the car, I said. It wasn't a request. Where are we going, Bev? The storage unit is in Savannah, and the EPA agents said we shouldn't leave the property while they're sampling. The EPA is looking for chemicals in the dirt, Cassandra. I'm looking for the blood in our history. If Mama kept a secret from Grandma Hattie, it wasn't about a landfill. It was about us. I didn't wait for her to agree. I walked to my SUV, the gravel crunching under my boots. I could feel the eyes of Agent Vance on my back, but I didn't turn around. I was no longer an executor assisting a federal investigation. I was a daughter following a ghost. The drive to Savannah was a study in silence. Cassandra sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing blur of marshland and moss-draped oaks. I drove with the steady, practiced precision of a woman who had spent half her life in transit, Charlotte to Savannah, Savannah to Atlanta, boardrooms to hospital rooms. Why didn't you tell me you were drowning? I asked, my voice barely louder than the hum of the tires. Cassandra didn't look at me. Because you always looked like you were swimming so perfectly, Bev. You make everything look easy. The way you handle the bills, the way you talk to the doctors, the way you just exist. It's intimidating. To the rest of us who can barely keep our heads above water, looking at you is a reminder of everything we aren't. I wasn't swimming, Cassandra. I was treading water with all of you on my shoulders. Did it never occur to you that if I made it look easy, it was because I didn't want you to feel the weight? We felt it anyway, she whispered. We felt the judgment in your silence. Every time you'd write a check without a word, it felt like you were buying another piece of our dignity. Terrence, he hated it the most. He wanted to be the man of the family, but he was always the boy asking for his allowance. The transactional love, again. It was a poison that had seeped into our marrow. I had thought my generosity was a shield. To them, It was a cage. I had focused so much on the foundation that I had forgotten that people have to live in the house. We reached the storage facility, a nondescript row of corrugated metal buildings on the industrial outskirts of the city. The heat here was different. It was metallic, smelling of hot asphalt and stagnant salt air. I found Unit 402. The lock was modern, but the door was rusted at the bottom. I inserted the key. It turned with a satisfying heavy thunk. I slid the door up. The screech of metal on metal echoed through the empty alleyway. The unit was small, packed with the detritus of a life our mother had lived in the shadows of Hattie Mae's looming presence. There were boxes of old clothes, a sewing machine, and stacks of Jet magazines from the 80s. But in the very back, beneath a heavy canvas tarp, sat the blue trunk. It was an old steamer trunk, the kind used for transatlantic voyages a century ago. The leather straps were cracked, and the brass hardware was green with oxidation. I knelt in the dust. My silk blouse was ruined, but I didn't care. I pulled the latch. The trunk opened with a sigh of trapped air. I expected jewelry or old photos. Instead, I found a neatly organized collection of birth certificates, marriage licenses, and a thick stack of letters tied with a black ribbon. I pulled out the birth certificates first. Hattie Mae Hollowell, Silas Vance Hollowell, Beverly Jeanette Hollowell. Then I found a certificate I didn't recognize. Arthur Miller, Jr. I froze. I looked at the date. 1948. The same year my father was born. I began to read the letters. They weren't addressed to our mother. They were addressed to her mother, Grandma Hattie, and they were signed by Arthur Miller, Sr., the grand old man of Savannah, the pillar of the white community, the man who had supposedly spent his life trying to take our land. As I read, the world as I knew it began to dissolve. The letters weren't threats. They were love letters, or at least the desperate, tortured correspondence of a man who was living a double life. My grandfather, Silas, hadn't just been a surveyor's assistant. He had been the cover. He had married Hattie Mae to provide a name for a child that wasn't his. My father. The Hollowell legacy wasn't a story of a black family holding on to their land against a white developer. It was a story of a white man trying to buy back his own blood without the world finding out. "Bev?" Cassandra asked, kneeling beside me. "What is it?" "We aren't just Hollowells, Cassandra," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "We're Millers. Our father was Arthur Miller Sr.'s firstborn son. He was the one who was supposed to inherit the Miller estate, but he was the wrong color." I held up the birth certificate. "Arthur Miller III, the man who's been trying to take this land, is our cousin. And he knows. He's known the whole time." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The reason Arthur Miller was so desperate for the limestone shelf wasn't just about mercury or landfills. It was about the fact that if the Hollowell Trust was ever fully audited by the state, the biological link between the two families would be discovered. In the Georgia of the 50s, that was a scandal. In the Georgia of today, with the Miller family sitting on a political and social throne built on purity and old guard values, it was an extinction-level event. The land wasn't just dirt. It was the physical evidence of a secret that would dismantle the Miller dynasty. "Mama knew," I whispered. "She found these after Grandma Hattie started to lose her memory. She didn't tell us because she knew what the Millers would do to protect their name. She knew they'd kill us to keep this quiet. And Terrence? Cassandra asked. Did he know? Terrence found the letter, but I don't think he understood the certificates, I said. He just saw a way to get money. He thought he was selling a house. He didn't realize he was selling our birthright. I dug deeper into the trunk. At the very bottom, beneath a layer of old quilts, I found a second ledger. This one wasn't from a church. It was a personal diary kept by Arthur Miller Sr. I opened it to the last page. I have given Silas the mineral rights. I have given him the land. It is the only way I can provide for my son without the council hanging me from a tree. If the boys ever find out, my legitimate boys, they will come for the dirt. I have left the maps in the smokehouse as a trap. The day they try to dig, they will uncover their own father's shame. I closed the diary. My grandfather, the man I had idolized as a self-made hero, had been a man who accepted a burden that wasn't his to carry. He had loved Hattie Mae enough to protect her secret, to raise another man's son as his own, and to spend his life pretending to be a surveyor while he was actually a guardian of a bloodline. I felt a sudden, fierce pride. Silas Hollowell was more of a man than Arthur Miller could ever dream of being. He didn't give us his blood, but he gave us his name, his protection, and his strength. But the strong black woman in me, the one who had been trained to protect everyone, finally understood why I was so tired. I had been fighting a war for a family that wasn't even mine by blood, against a family that was. What do we do now? Cassandra asked. She looked terrified. I stood up, clutching the diary and the certificates. I felt the matriarch's grace shift. It wasn't about being quiet anymore. It wasn't about being restrained. Now, I said, we go back to the house, and we invite Arthur Miller to a family reunion. Bev, you can't! He'll have us arrested. He'll do exactly what I tell him to do, I said. Because I don't just have his land anymore. I have his identity. And I'm going to show him exactly what happens when the strong black woman stops being the foundation and starts being the wrecking ball. We left the storage unit. As we drove back toward the red clay of the Hollowell property, the sun began to set. The sky turned a deep, bruised crimson, the color of old secrets and new blood. I called Marcus Thorne. Marcus, I said when he answered, I need you to contact the Savannah Morning News. Tell them Beverly Hollowell is holding a press conference on the porch of the Hollowell home tomorrow at noon. Tell them it's not about the landfill. Then what is it about, Beverly? It's about a homecoming, I said. I hung up. I looked at Cassandra. She was still shaking, but she was looking at me with a new kind of intensity. Not the look of a dependent, but the look of a survivor. Are you going to tell them? She asked. The whole world? I'm going to give Arthur Miller a choice, I said. He can either acknowledge his kin and set up a trust that bails out every family his grandfather cheated in this county, or I can read this diary on the 6 o'clock news. He'll kill you before he lets that happen, Bev. He can try, I said, touching the gold band on my pinky. But he's forgotten one thing. He's a Miller. He's built on paper and lies. I'm a Hollowell. I'm built on iron and silence. And I've finally found my voice. When we pulled back into the drive, the EPA agents were gone. The state troopers were still there, guarding the smokehouse. I walked onto the porch. The black SUV was already there, idling in the dark. Arthur Miller III stepped out. He looked tired. He looked like a man who was running out of shadows to hide in. "I hear you went to the city, Beverly," he said. "Looking for more old papers?" I walked to the edge of the porch. I didn't hide the blue trunk's contents. I held the diary up so the moonlight hit the Miller family crest on the cover. "I didn't find papers, Arthur," I said. "I found a cousin, and I think you owe me 40 years of back pay for holding up your family's reputation." The silence that followed was the heaviest I'd ever heard. It wasn't the silence of the night. It was the silence of a kingdom falling. Miller's face went from pale to a ghastly, translucent gray. He looked at the diary, then at me. For the first time, he didn't look like a councilman. He looked like a frightened boy. "What do you want?" he whispered. "I want the grace you never gave us," I said. "And I want you to get off my porch. We have a lot of work to do before the cameras arrive." I watched him stumble back into his SUV. I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the pines. I turned to Cassandra. "Go inside," I said. "Make some tea. It's going to be a long night." "Are you coming in?" "In a minute," I said. I stood on the porch, looking out at the land. My land. My foundation. My truth. The matriarch had finally stopped carrying the weight. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just strong. I was free.